So we're doing Parshas Shemini, and as we've been progressing through creating the Mishkan, or building the Mishkan, organizing the Mishkan, inaugurating the Mishkan, and now that's where we are. We're in this section where we're really doing an inauguration of the Kohanim and the Mishkan itself, and we'll see as we get into it. And it begins by saying, "Vayi b'yom hashmini." It was on the 8th day that what? Kara Moshe Aaron. Moshe calls to Aaron, Ubanov, and to his children, Uleziknei Yisrael, and to the elders, and he says, V'yomer el Aaron. So Hashem, he says to Aaron, Kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatas. You should take an egel, right, for a sin offering, okay, a young as a sin offering, and then it says V'ayal leola tamimim, and it goes on through the other sacrifices. But then it says, interestingly enough, Ve'el bnei Yisrael. Then he tells the Jewish people to daber. You should go take a goat for a sin offering. So what? Suddenly this goat appears. Up until now, we've had different types of offerings, and we just had one where it talked about taking an egel, which is a calf, and suddenly it tells the Jewish people to take a sin offering. What is the sin that they did, that they have to offer, and why a goat? Because before we didn't have a goat in this offering. So the commentaries tell us that it's referring back to the fact of the selling of Yosef. That Yosef was sold by the brothers, which would of course be the Jewish people today, because the brothers are the fathers of all of the Jewish people in this time of the Torah, even today. And they and it says that they took a goat, and they killed a goat and took the blood, and they put the blood from the goat into the coat into the blood of the goat, and then they took it to Yaakov and said, right, you see, your son has been killed. So this says that in order to remember this, that they went and they took this goat, and they sold Yosef, right, which was a sin and caused all of the trouble that it caused. Therefore, they're doing a sin offering now to receive atonement for selling Yosef. Now that's a very nice that's happening, and it's a good thing that it happens. However, we have to wonder why now. Because I would think, if we think this through, the Jewish people, right, or the brothers who later became the Jewish people, went and they killed this goat in order so they could cover up, right, the selling of Yosef. So it caused us to go down to Egypt. Right, it had an effect that we went down to Egypt. Yosef went down to Egypt. We had all of the troubles of Egypt. So when do you think we should offer the goat? We should offer the goat when we were leaving Egypt. In other words, we had a sacrifice, right? We had the Passover offering, the Pesach sacrifice, right, which is offered the night before the Jews left. That was the big one. We do it in the days of the temple. We do it every year, right? Families get together and have a Passover offering. Today we have a Seder. It's the closest we can get. But so why didn't God just make it that don't use a lamb, use a goat? And that way you can have atonement for the sin that caused you to come here in the first place. I'm taking you out, God says, right? I'm taking you out, not because necessarily you deserve it, but I'm taking you out. So if you want to atone for what you did wrong, do it now. Why does it wait all of this time until now in the Mishkan? They're inaugurating the Mishkan, and now God says, oh, you're inaugurating the Mishkan, now you have to get forgiven for the sin of selling Yosef. Right? It doesn't seem to make sense. But the answer is, I believe, based on some of the commentaries I saw, is that what was the idea behind the selling of Yosef? Yeah, what was actually I mean, there's a terrible sin. I mean, they kidnapped him, they sold him, they lied to their father. But really, what was the sort of the essence of the sin? And was hatred. They were jealous of him. The father treated him differently than everyone else. He was sort of, they say he was a nar. He was like an adolescent. He was perhaps, at this point in his life, to some extent, was perhaps a little bit obvious about the fact that he was treated better, and that he would tell his father things about the brothers, and he would rat them out, as they'd say. Right? He was not necessarily somebody who caused you to want to like him. Right? And so the brothers were upset, they were jealous, they had sibling rivalry, they went all through all of these different types of words that we can use for it, but they basically didn't like the guy, and they got rid of him. Right? So it was sinus chinam, hatred of brothers, right? Hatred among people. That caused it. What is the Mishkan that we built? The purpose of the Mishkan is to atone for all types of things, but including one of the main things is the unity of the Jewish people. We have to be unified. It causes us to be unified. It says that right, the presence of God was in the Ol Moed, in the gathering place where everybody would unify and gather together. There was only one God. There's only one Mishkan. There is one Jewish people. If God is unified and the Mishkan is singular, then the Jewish people have to be unified. And therefore, it makes perfect sense that if you're going to look to atone for the sin of the sinus chinam, of the hatred that caused this to happen, then we can now understand why it is that they're doing it now. Now, at the time when the Mishkan represents the unity and the singular unity of the Jewish people being one unit, that really makes a big difference. That's really the idea. And when they left Egypt, while it might have been time-wise more appropriate, it didn't fit the occasion. Right? Fitting the occasion was then making a stand against the Egyptians, so they went and they took the god of the Egyptians, the lamb, the sheep, and they used it for a sacrifice in order to show that we're not subjugating ourselves to the people around us. We're going to do what God wants. And the idea that they would atone for the sin of hatred, that may have been what was the ultimate catalyst leading them down to Egypt, even though they were supposed to go. Nevertheless, it's done later because the root of the sin was the fighting, right? And therefore, this is where they do it. Now, interestingly enough, I think if we look at recent events, I was writing about this a bit, seeing. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to actually distribute it or when I finish or not. But this I've been writing about what I'm saying is sort of a bit of an elephant in the room. Right? The idea being there's something going on and nobody seems to really be talking about it, at least until the point I started, in a very rational way, which is what's going on with Israel. With a lot of people are talking about how the fact that Israel has decided that they're going to draft the Haredi men, right? The men, which up until now they didn't do, and they didn't do it just because they didn't want to. It was part of the formation of the state. It was an agreement between some of the great rabbis of the era and Ben Gurion. They got together and they made an agreement. Now, of course, there's little question to the fact that Ben Gurion thought that at worst we're talking about a small number of people, and that most likely they would dwindle, and instead the Orthodox community, or the right-wing Orthodox community in Israel, has multiplied. Right, it has gotten much bigger, and so the reports of its demise are greatly exaggerated, and they're very large. And now you have a large segment of the community that's not fighting, and there's pluses and minuses. I mean, on the one hand, we believe as Jews that there is an idea that Torah study and observance of mitzvahs plays a very serious role in the success of the Jewish people in a esoteric manner, in a manner that's not, you can't put it on paper. You can't say, just like the military, we've got 1,000 soldiers and they got 500 soldiers, chances are we're going to win. But the fact is that we as Jews look at these things in a bigger picture, and part of it is the spiritual role, which really is governing the physical. It's behind the scenes, but it's actually more powerful than the physical. So for people to be sitting and learning Torah and to doing mitzvahs and to doing things in order to keep the Jews safe is an important aspect of our belief. And not only of our belief, but we find this in almost every Western country of the world. When I was growing up, I remember they had the Vietnam War and people were being drafted. But if you were a religious person, in general, they wouldn't draft you, because they couldn't do what you needed, and that there were certain amount of respect or difference that they looked at you, and they wouldn't draft you. So anyone who was in a yeshiva in those days would not get drafted to the war. And that was done in America, that's done in other places, done in Canada, where religious people have an exemption. Even if they don't have the belief that we have, that religious people are actually fighting the war in a spiritual way, nevertheless, a lot of countries do this, and Israel was one of them, and now they're changing. So you have a fight on both sides, because on the one hand, it seems, and I'm not making a proclamation, but it seems that the Haredi community is abusing this concept. And what's happened now is that the men are not working, and the men are all studying, if it's appropriate for them to be studying or not appropriate for them to be studying, depending on their personality and their abilities. And what's happening is, because they're doing this, it's either they're doing this in order to not get drafted, or they're doing this and none of them are getting drafted. I can't say what their intention is. But clearly there are some people who because of the peer pressure that they have, who are sitting and studying Torah for their entire life, and they're really not doing it. Not that they're lying, they don't have the capabilities. Many people do have the capabilities, and hopefully they are doing it. But there are those who aren't, and it could be because they don't want to go to the army, or it could be because of peer pressure, but whatever it is, they're not doing it. And therefore, the community is saying it's good enough, right, that our children should fight and die, but your children shouldn't fight and die because you're religious. On the other hand, we know that in our belief that the spiritual effect of people learning makes a difference. It's not just an esoteric idea, it's a real thing. It really does. So we don't know how to weigh it. Now, on top of it, you've got the Israeli government, who has made this statement and has decided to pass laws where people theoretically could actually go to jail. Just like in America, if you didn't show up for the draft, they'd put you in jail. Right? You're a draft dodger. You can go to jail for that. So the same thing in Israel. So now you're going to have yeshiva guys theoretically being put in jail for not going to the army. And some of them, it's not appropriate. And some of them, it might be. But then add to it, right, this whole dilemma going on. Should they be drafted? Should they not be drafted? If they should be drafted, should everyone be drafted? If they shouldn't be drafted, then why are they doing this? And you have this whole argument going on. But then you have, all right, so in Israel, it's very common to have protests. You can gather together a number of thousands of people and you protest for it, against it, with it, on it, under it. People protest all the time, and they're making statements because they care and they're trying to express themselves. But in Israel, I always believe that it's a bit different when it comes to expressing issues with the state than it is here. Because here, like you look what happens with these guys who call themselves the Neturei Karta, right? They're not even. I don't even think that they really are the Neturei Karta. These guys, the ones who go to like Iran and meet with the president of Iran. We used to meet with Arafat. They meet with people who hate the Jews, regardless of what people might say. We don't hate the Jews. We only hate Israel. We hate the political thing, whatever. They themselves claim that they themselves they're observant Jews, or at least have the appearance of being, and they say we're anti-Israel because it shouldn't be a state, and we're against what they're doing. But of course, we're not anti-Jews. But how does the world see them? I think the world sees them in two ways. Either they're kooks and they don't even think about him, or they say, you see, even the Jews themselves have a problem with Israel. Right? So either way, when we start making noise against Israel in public outside of Israel, in Canada, for instance, I think that this end, I believe, is true, that the people around us, they either think we're being silly, or they think that finally the Jews have woken up and realized how terrible the Israeli government is, and that we agree with them, and then they're going to act, and they're going to do things that try to destroy Israel because of all the things they say about Israel, and we don't agree with them. But if you look, whenever you have these types of people who go to the extreme and they go to visit Arafat, or they would go to visit the president of Iran, or they go to these different places. They used to go to see Gaddafi, right? I mean, they used to go to the craziest things they would do. You'd find the anti-Semites, the ones who are known to be anti-Semites, not just the people who pretend not to be, but the ones who really are open about it, will always take these people as examples to show you how the Jews themselves even realize how bad they are, right? So now there's a request from responsible people who are saying that the Jews outside of Israel have to make a statement. They have to publicly let it be known that they're against what Israel's doing, or for what Israel's doing. But these statements are asking us to be against it, and a number of communities have organized rallies that's been against it. And what's happened is that you have all of these arguments within the Jewish community. Should they be drafted? Should they not be drafted? Well, if they should not be drafted, and they're going to draft them, should we be publicly, coming out against Israel, and not publicly coming out against Israel? How do we deal with it, and what do we do? And all of these issues are the elephant in the room, because the real part of this that I find is really troublesome is that this brings us back again to another example of our fighting with each other. Because it's not that we're disagreeing. That's perfectly fine. If you feel, right, that based on Torah, on our knowledge of Torah, that it's necessary for everyone equally to go to the army, then if you can show this from the Torah, then it's fine. And if you feel that it's not, then also you have to be able to show from the Torah, and that's fine. But that's not what's happened. I see people who are friends for years, and now they're not friends. People who were being able to talk and get along, suddenly they're not. You have people on a board of directors of one institution are starting to argue with the head of the institution because he's making a stand one way and they're the other way. suddenly it's becoming, right, a cause célèbre by many, many different places, and it's causing fighting among people, just like we have fighting with, as we were talking about here, in the case with Yosef and his brothers. And the bottom line is rather than dealing peacefully with the issue, where you can have your opinion, I can have my opinion, and we can be tolerant of each other's opinions as long as they're both within Torah. We can tolerate each other's opinions, right? I can tolerate is not, so it doesn't sound like such a good word, but it's actually a wonderful word, because mostly we think tolerate means, I'm not going to do anything to stop you, right? That's all. I don't want you to do it, but I'm not going to stop you. But really, tolerate means is that I allow you peacefully to have your opinion and act on your opinion as I have my opinion and act on my opinion. That's tolerating, and that's what we should be doing. Right? We should be able to say that there are those among us who have legitimate beliefs that in this occasion, right, we should make a public statement against Israel. And there are others who say that you can't make a public statement against Israel. And there are those people who say, why would we make a public statement against Israel? Because we think they should be drafted. Or others who say, no, they shouldn't be drafted, and Israel's acting anti-Semitically. So you have all different opinions going on, and they're all fighting with each other, but it's becoming personal. And I find when this happens, which happens all too often with the Jewish people, we lose sight of the real issue, and that's the elephant in the room, which is it's another reason that we fight with each other. Instead of disagree, tolerate, support, right, we fight with each other. And that's really sad.
It's only for a few years, though. I mean,
yeah, but it's become now, the Israeli government passed the rule. Right?
Yeah.
Before they were deferring it and deferring it and deferring it, and they'd pass it, but they wouldn't apply it. Now suddenly they're doing it.
Yeah.
And now it's become a real issue. Here in Toronto, we've had a number of different groups try to organize gatherings. One of them did. I don't know how large it was, but they had the support of many great people, and they put on a gathering. And we had another one that people tried to do, and most people didn't want to be a part of it. But what was behind it, behind the scenes, was a lot of fighting. And fighting in a way that wasn't a disagreement on issues. It started to become disagreements with people, where it was sad. I actually spoke to one person who was vehemently, changed in his opinion of somebody that he used to learn a lot from, because that person made a statement, that he felt that the Israeli government was wrong and that they shouldn't be drafting, and he felt differently. But it went to the point where he couldn't tolerate the relationship anymore. Not right, and this is not a person who's unstable or difficult, pretty regular person. But we see what's happening, and that's why this is sad, and that's why we have here such a significant thing as the Mishkan, where the first thing the Jewish people do when they come in, they have to offer an offering for a sin that they did hundreds of years earlier because of the fighting among themselves. There is nothing wrong with the fact that Yosef and his brothers, right, had differences of opinions. But they didn't have to fight. They didn't have to want to kill him. They didn't have to throw him in a pit. They didn't have to sell him. That's the sin, right? It's not, the disagreement is not a sin. There's nothing wrong with having different opinions. You have in our neighborhood, you had Chabad follows one way, the Sephardim are another way, we're another way. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. And people ask me all the time, and I tell them, it's legitimate. They're totally allowed to do it, right? They have a source in Torah to do what they're doing. It's fine. They can do it. But it's not my way. So that's not the way I'm going to do it, and I also have the right to do it. As soon as we go beyond that, that's where our problem lies, where they don't have a right to do it, and it's not right what they do, and they can't do that. That's wrong. I have no ability to say such a thing. I can't say that another Jew who has a Torah source for what they're doing is wrong, just because my Torah source is different, or my understanding of it is different. So one will read the blessing for the state of Israel, and one won't read the blessing for the state of Israel, and one person will eat matzah balls on Pesach, and one won't. Right? They all have a source for it, so they're fine. It's just not. I have my way, and if I wanted to do it your way, I'd do it your way. So I think my way's best, but your way's not wrong. It's just not my way. That's all. If we could do that more often, we wouldn't be offering these sacrifices all the time. All right, so let's go on. So here in verse 7, it has Yomer Moshe, right? Well, in 6 it says that Moshe goes to the Moed, and he goes and he speaks to Aaron. Yeah, in 7. Yomer Moshe Aaron. Moshe says to Aaron, Kar v'la mizbeach. He tells Aaron, go do your job. You're the high priest. Go to the mizbeach, the altar, and do the sin offerings that you're supposed to do. Why does Moshe have to tell Aaron to do that? We've already been commanded to do it. So why does he have to? So he says, the Medrash says that Aaron believed that God was mad at him, that God did not want him to offer the sacrifices because of Aaron's role originally in the golden calf. And Aaron felt that because of that, and the whole Mishkan came around as a result of the golden calf. So Aaron felt that God is sending me a message that he doesn't want me to do this. So Moshe says to him, no, that's not true. God's accepted what you did. God accepted and knows why you did what you did. He accepted your reason, and he is not angry with you. So go to the Mizbeach, go to the altar, go do your job, he tells them. Right? So you have to wonder then, why would Aaron think that? I understand there are people who have insecurities, or people who don't know themselves, right? Like most of us today. We have these problems where very often we only know ourselves by how other people relate to us. So I might think that someone's mad at me when they're not mad at me. But we're talking about Aaron HaKohen and God, right? Aaron HaKohen was a prophet. Right, so how can it be that he had this mistake that he thinks God's mad at him and God's not mad at him? Only Moshe knew, but Aaron didn't know. So I understand that Moshe is a greater prophet than Aaron. He might have a better idea. But here, Aaron is wrong. It's not that he doesn't have all the details. He's actually wrong. God is not angry with him. So we have an interesting point here, is that it's not that a person should think they're wrong when they're not wrong, but a person needs to have the ability to look within themselves and to try to see themselves if their own actions are really for the right reason, if they're correct. We know that God can look within us and see why we do what we do. I can tell you that I'm, like I can act in a humble way, but I'm really not humble because I just want you to think I'm humble, right? But God knows the truth. He knows that I'm not. You might think I am because I can do this, but God knows the truth. So Aaron also, right, he should have a person of his stature who is a prophet should know where his standing is, who he is, right, who Aaron actually is. And yet he seems to question himself and doubt himself. And this idea is not an insignificant idea of having a certain amount of self-doubt. There's nothing wrong with having a good self-image and be self-assured in what you're doing. But to also have the ability to be able to look in yourself and to say that maybe I'm doing something wrong is an important aspect. I mean, we see it often with parents with children, right? Like we had an instance, and I'm not citing any particular parent because I don't know who it happened to, but I can just make the story up because I know the facts. The facts was that we open our children's program at 10 o'clock. So sometimes the people come with their kids before 10 o'clock. So it's no big deal, so they come. But this week, the kids came before 10 o'clock, and some kids maliciously, willfully destroyed some things on a wall downstairs. There's no adults there. They were just some kids. And they realized what they were doing, but whatever reason they did it, they're kids. Kids do these things, right? Sometimes they don't make good choices. So now the rest of this is fiction. Right? But we have to now speak to the parents, right? So you can imagine I call a parent, and I didn't. I don't even know who it is. But I call a parent and I say, your son acknowledged to me that he was one of the kids who went downstairs and he purposely damaged some of the items on the wall that belongs to the daycare. And he told me he did it. He acknowledged it to me. And the parent will deny it. The parent will say, oh, my child would never do that. No, it's not. It can't be. He's just afraid of you. He doesn't want to tell you the truth. He's afraid it's going to be worse if he says that it wasn't him. But I know it wasn't him. Right? You have people who can't see, right, the reality until the reality becomes so bad that they're in trouble. Right? That's the extreme of what I mean here. Here, Aaron was the opposite. Aaron could have been secure in who he was, but he questioned himself. And questioning oneself is an important thing. Not doubting oneself, but questioning oneself to see what are my motives, why am I doing what I'm doing, why is this going on. So that for Aaron to say that maybe God's angry with me is because Aaron could have looked within himself and said that maybe there was some of my actions were that I doubted that my brother was coming back, or I doubted that things were going to be the way they were, and therefore I had a little bit of lack of faith. Now, I'm not saying that Aaron did, but the fact that he asks of himself is not a negative. It's a positive. And we need to be able to do that. We need to be able to look within ourselves and look around, and the people who we care about, and to be able to say if there's a flaw. If we don't, I know from my counseling experience that if you have people who are living together, a couple, or parents and a child, and they don't address a flaw within the other one, right, and they can live for 30, 40 years with the other person, and there's this whatever flaw it is, you say, I love them, that's not so bad, I wouldn't leave them over this flaw. That's fine, but if you don't address it, it gets worse. And then over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it can become the issue that ends up causing you to split up, when it shouldn't. If you just address it. Also, it's not necessarily fair to the person who, if they objectively have a flaw, and you can help them fix it, get better, and you don't tell them. If you really care for them, you should be prepared to take a little bit of anxiety when you tell them something negative in order to better them. Right? So those are also, important things to try to do in light of the same thing. So he tells them, go there. Do this, various sacrifices that you're supposed to do. Then it says, Vayikra of Aaron al Mizbeach, so Aaron does it. He goes and he does what he's told, right? And then it details what he does with the blood and the animal, and how he takes all the different parts of it and so forth. We then have, on 591 in verse 22, we have here Aaron raises his hands towards the people and he blesses them. Then he descends from having performed the sin offering. So here you have Aaron does these various offerings, and then he does what we call Birkas Kohanim. Birkas Kohanim means the blessing of the Kohanim. So he would stand, he'd face the people, he would raise his hands in a very unique way, and by doing that, he would say the words of the Torah to bless the Jewish people. And it's a special blessing that was given to Aaron because of how Aaron's respect and love for people. He was given the ability to bless them, and it's handed down in his spiritual DNA to his children. And this is the reference that we see it, and we also actually don't have it right here, but we have the wording. We all know the wording. We say it many different times, but it's an important part of the rituals that they did. Beginning the next page, we are introduced to two of Aaron's sons who do not have a good end. It tells us here on 592 and 593, Aaron, the sons of Aaron took something. What did they take? Who were they? Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu is very interesting. Just as a side point, you know how we have a custom of naming our children for our parents when our parents, God forbid, aren't living? Right, or for our ancestors, and you can actually often identify families. Like I know in our own family, we were able to identify a part of my wife's family from like 1,200 years ago because they had the same first names. Right? They had the last name, but that could be a lot of people. But the same first names also, which meant that they were naming for somebody in their family, which we're still doing the same names. So we knew that there was some relationship. So one of the sources that you do this comes here, and one of the sources that comes here also of how you can name a man for a woman. Now you have women, like somebody's mother dies, and they have a son. So what do? That means the mother doesn't get named. But you could actually name it. My mother used to tell me, and she come from German Jewry, and that they had a belief in their custom that if you named a man after a woman, like in your family, that it was a big merit for the woman, because of course the man did different mitzvahs than a woman did, so it would merit her in a way that she couldn't do it herself, right? A man would put on tefillin, a woman doesn't put on tefillin, right? Different things like that. So it comes from here, from Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu, so Avihu is pretty simple. Avihu, from his father, Avihu, right? He's from my father, so he's named for his father, who was Amram. But he had a mother also. So his mother, they say Nadav. Nadav means one who gives, right? And his mother was known as someone who was kind, who gave people, right? That's the symbol for us of giving. You give and you give and you give. So it says that Nadav was named for his mother, right? That would be Moshe's mother, Aaron's mother, Miriam's mother, the same mother. He was named for his mother, and his other son was named for his father. So here we find an example where the two children are named for their parents, and one is named for a woman. In any case, it's got nothing to do with what we're discussing here, just telling you that fact. They're Nadav and Avihu. They're the next generation of Kohanim. So they're going to do the service. So Ish Machteu, they went and took these little shovels. They had these shovels that they used for sacrifices, for spices. Vayitnu behen eish, and they would put fire in there. V'yisim leketoris, and they put spices on it, like incense. They would burn incense. Vayikru lifnei Hashem, and they went and they offered this as a sacrifice before God. What was it that they offered? Eish zara, a strange sacrifice. In other words, their own idea. They decided, we're going to do this. We want to worship God. We're going to worship God this way. This is what we're going to do. God told us you have to do this, do this, do this. That's fine. We did this, this, and this. Now we want to use our own creativity. We want to do something different. And it's God didn't command them to do it. And the end is that a fire came out from God, and it ate them. It destroyed them. It burnt them up. And they died. So because now this is not a call people shouldn't be creative. What it's saying is that when you're in the temple, right, everything is prescribed. The temple is like an extremely intense situation where every single thing that a person does in the temple has great, great, deep meaning. And everything has been prescribed by God. And suddenly they come in and they do what they're supposed to do, but then they go and they do this other thing, which is their own idea, and you can't do that here. And they died. That's how serious it was. That God, they couldn't do that and get away with it. So they died. The commentaries ask all types of questions, actually, what went on here, because they find it hard to believe that they would actually die for this. Conceptually, we can understand it. So, but they say that there were all different things that actually went on, that really they were wanted to take over for Moshe and Aaron, because they would be and they were supposed to, by the way. They says that another one was that they were drunk. Then they felt they were going to get to a higher spiritual level, so they used a substance, drugs, drinking, in order to raise themselves up to a higher level. That was the strange thing that they did, right? In other words, they felt it's one thing that I can go and when I'm perfectly clear-minded and I worship God, right? But then I want to get to that next level. So maybe if I have a couple of drinks, it will relax me and my mind will open and I'll become more creative. No matter what generation you're in, artists will always tell you that altering their mind with some substance or another will make them more creative. In the end, I think most of them tell you it didn't work in the end, but while it's happening, they'll all tell you it works. And this is an example, the same kind of thing, where they wanted to use a substance. And here God says, no, that's not how you do it. When you want to become close to God, you use the gifts that God gave you. You don't try to do it in a different way, especially when you're dealing with something within the temple, which is so precise. So there are all different answers for this as to what went on. But what happens next is, right, they died. So then it says, V'yomer Moshe al Aaron, hu asher diber esav. So Moshe goes now to comfort his brother. He just lost his two sons, two special sons. They're very special sons. And he says, he goes and he speaks to them, and he says that, God said, he says, God said to me that I will be sanctified by way of those who are closest to me. That's in the quote in the Torah. And so Moshe tells Aaron, I actually thought God was talking about me and you. Sanctified means that the death of these people, whoever it is, right, is going to atone for the sins of the Jewish people to some extent. They're closest to me. They have a special relationship with me. Not necessarily their untimely death, just their death. The death itself, right, because of the life that they led. So Moshe tells Aaron, I thought it was me and you God was talking about. That when we died, it would be an atonement for the Jewish people because of the lives we led. Now we see it wasn't me and you. It was Nadav and Avihu. They died, and they accomplished what we thought, right? So we can think about whatever we'd like with specifically the story, but I think that it's also funny that Moshe says this. Moshe says, it's like this, God says, I'm going to pick like the finest people, and when those people die, it's going to have an effect on me. It's going to be good for the Jewish people eventually, and it'll have an effect on me. So Moshe says, well, what God says is going to be the finest. I thought it was me and you, right? So you think for a guy who's known, the Torah says, the humblest of all people, and which Moshe is, this is a fact. Right? This is a fact, not an opinion. Moshe was the most humble person who ever lived. So if that's true, how could he say that? How could he say that when God said, I'm going to pick the best people in the world, it was me and you, Aaron? Okay, I can say it was you, I can say. All right, picked you. You're there, he can still be humble. But me and you, me too. So we have to, in order to answer this, the only reason this is a question is because we don't understand what the word being humble really means. What it really means to be humble. And the true idea of being humble does not mean that you're foolish. You don't know who you are. Being humble means you know who you are, but you also know that it doesn't make you better than other people. It makes you better in an area, just like somebody else is better in an area, but not more than that. Right? So if you are, for instance, the greatest dancer in the history of the world, right? So nothing wrong with knowing that you're the greatest dancer in the history of the world, and nobody else can do as good as you. But you're not a better person. You're not. You shouldn't be looking down on people for other reasons, right? Because you're just great at that. God gave you a gift. You worked on the gift. You became great at it. You should receive, a reward for this. You should receive praise for this. But you should not be arrogant because of it, right? You should not think you're greater than other people. You could be greater in this area. In other words, a person who is humble knows who they are. But a person who is humble knows it doesn't make them better. Moshe himself wrote that Moshe was the most humble of all people who ever lived. He wrote those words. How could he write those words if he actually believed it? Because he understood that I am the most humble person in the history of the world. I am. It doesn't mean I'm better than you. I'm just the most humble person. So they tell a story. I think it'll illustrate it. Everyone tells this story, so I'll use the same one, which is with Rabbi Yecheskel Avramsky, who was in England, who was like the chief rabbi, basically. He wasn't the official chief rabbi, but among the sort of the right wing, he was the great leader of the Jewish people. And they were then, like again now, this is happening all over Europe, they were talking about outlawing shechita, that it was cruel, that they wanted to stop the Jews from slaughtering animals according to Jewish law. They felt that it was wrong. And they went through a whole series of legislative law, and they finally wanted witnesses. So they got this Rabbi Abramsky to come and to give testimony. So the court case is sort of like this. He comes in, and they say to him, okay, would you swear? You're going to tell the truth. And he tells them, I can't really swear. Okay, fine. He says, Rabbi Abramsky, let's let the court know who you are. Tell me, are you the finest expert on Jewish law in all of England? And he says, yes, I am. And he says, and are you the greatest expert on the laws of kosher slaughtering in all of England? He says, yes, I am. And then they say that the judge looks over to him and says, Rabbi Avramsky, I have to ask you, your religion says it's important to be humble. How can you be humble with what you just said? So they say that he answered him by saying, well, Your Honor, I'm under oath. Right? So it's making light of it. But the fact is that the judge, if the story is accurate, the judge doesn't understand what it means to be humble. To be humble doesn't mean you're stupid and you don't know yourself. It means you know who you are. He is the greatest rabbinic mind in all of England at that time. He was. There's no question. But he wasn't arrogant, and he didn't think he was better than somebody else. He was more knowledgeable. That other guy was a better car mechanic, and that other guy was better with people, and that other guy could save lives. Now, if someone's dying in the street, Rabbi Abramsky couldn't do anything for him, but a doctor could. Right? If somebody came to ask the laws of kosher, the doctor might not be able to answer it, but Rabbi Abramsky could. So he wasn't a better, right? That's how he understood. He understood that's what it means is you know yourself. Moshe knew himself. Moshe knew he was one of the greatest people in the history of the world. He knew it. Right? It didn't make him better. He didn't treat people less. He didn't say that other people didn't have also great gifts and great things about them. He might have been the greatest leader, and somebody else was the greatest artist, and someone else was the greatest writer. And he has to acknowledge that. That's true. And he is not better than they are. He's just better in that area. So that's what he's saying here. He says, Aaron, that's the case. I thought it was me and you, because I objectively believe that that's what God meant. But it was wrong. And what he's saying there, of course, is that Nadav and Avihu were on a higher spiritual level than Moshe and Aaron in some ways, which is why God picked them. That they're the ones that when they died that this would happen. And then it goes on to say that when Moshe goes to see Aaron, it says, right, he says, as I said, that God sanctified through those who are nearest to me, and then it says, and Aaron was silent. Aaron didn't say anything. And the commentaries say that this is praise for Aaron, the fact that he didn't say anything. Why would that be? Is because when somebody dies, right, we go through a psychological process. and it's something the psychologists figured out in the last 100 years, but we've known this for a long time, which is the process goes first is denial. Right? You don't really accept in your psyche that the person died, so you have to come to terms with that. And then you have anger. Why did God do this to him? And then you have guilt. I should have been there more often. I should have been there for them. Right? And then you finally have acceptance. You accept that it happened. Right? You go through a process, a psychological process where that a person goes through when someone dies. Here it says Aaron was silent. Aaron didn't do this. Aaron didn't go and say, "We get angry at God. Why did you do this? These two children of mine, they were the most extraordinary children. They were going to be amazing assets to the Jewish people, and you just let them die." And he didn't do that. He was silent. In other words, Aaron understood, right, by going through the process himself. He went through this, and he understood. He accepted it, and he had he couldn't complain to God. He couldn't tell God, "It's wrong what you did. How could you do such a thing? I should have done this. You should have done this." He was silent, and they say that this was a positive thing for Aaron, that he was able to accept what happened and come to terms with it so quickly. So then it says that Moshe goes and calls for Aaron's other sons to come, and it calls them the Nosrim, the leftovers. Nosrim means leftover, meaning the ones who, there's literally, to use the right word here would be, he calls it the survivors. Aaron had 4 sons, 2 got killed, there were 2 left. So he calls the 2 other sons the survivors. And so he calls them by name, and the Torah calls them the survivors. But it's funny because they weren't really survivors. When we think of survivors, for instance, in the World War II, you have the Holocaust. Who's a survivor? Someone who went through it. I didn't go through it. I'm not a survivor. Right? My mother went through the war. My father didn't go through the war. My mother's a survivor. My father's not a survivor. But here, Moshe calls the 2 sons who weren't even there. They're the survivors, and the 2 who died are not the survivors. So, right, of course they didn't survive. But how could it be that they're called survivors if they weren't a part of it? They weren't there when they offered the wrong thing, and that those 2 got killed and these 2 stayed alive. They weren't there. So the idea is that we need to understand that even if we weren't present during the war, it is only because God wanted that we wouldn't be present during the war. In other words, I don't mean those of us who weren't born yet, but those of us who theoretically could have been there, right, and we weren't there, we're also survivors. Because God put us in a place where we survived. We survived. You survived in South Africa, right? My father survived in the United States, right? But he was a Jew, and if he had been in a different place, he might not have survived. So he is a survivor. Not in the way that the people, I'm not demeaning what the people went through who went through Auschwitz and came out and they survived. There are certainly survivors in a literal sense. But to understand it, for us, how do we look at it? We also have to look at ourselves as survivors, as people who have gone through something and that God saved us. He just saved us to a point that we didn't even have to go through the experience at all. My mother's a survivor. She went through the war and she came out. And she was damaged because of it, right? Her life was different because of it. She had idiosyncrasies because of it. She had problems her whole life because of it. She didn't have psychological help when she came out. They expected her to come out of the war and act normal, right? And they did the best they could, all these people. Right? They were survivors, and they didn't die. But those of us who were alive then are also survivors, because we need to realize that God saved us too. And if God saves us, there's a reason. There's a reason that you didn't go through the war. There's a reason you didn't die in the war. There's a reason that you're alive. The world calls that survivor's guilt, but we don't. We call that the opportunity to be able to come to terms with the reality of the world that we live in and our own role. Like, I don't believe that I'd have to, God forbid, have to experience cancer in order to learn how to be a better person by surviving cancer. Right? The reality is, when a lot of times people get sick, God forbid, they get cancer and they survive, which is wonderful. They survive, and they're better people. Right? I'm not saying that getting cancer is worth it. It's not. But when people get cancer and they survive, it changes them. Right? They become much more giving, usually, much more sensitive to the blessings that they have. They're much more doing things that are priorities. They often spend less time at work, more time with their family, because they've gone through this jolting experience which not only caused them to face death, but caused them to face life. Right? That's being a survivor. That's a cancer survivor. We're also survivors from the war, in that we weren't a part of it. And we need to also be able to look at our priorities in our lives in such a way that we're like that. So that's why Moshe calls these two the survivors, because they're the ones who have to learn from what happened to their brothers, learn to be better people because of it, and act that way. And we have to do the same in our lives. We have to act like that. That's like Moshe himself. Moshe was, I spoke about this when he was born, but when he was put into the Nile River, right, he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And Moshe had many names, but the name that we use is the name that Pharaoh's daughter gave him. It's an Egyptian name, which was Moshe. Right? Now Moshe was, because I took him out of the water. Right? But if you understand that to bring someone out, right, is not Moshe. Right? That a person who's taken out of the water would be Mashui. A different grammatical sense. That would be his name, right? Because he was taken out of the water. The way the grammar is of his name is telling us that who he really was is that because he was taken out of the water, he is one who takes others out of the water. And that's what Moshe's life became. He saved people. That's what he did. He went and he killed an Egyptian to save a Jew. He had to leave Egypt because he was saving a Jew. He came back to Egypt because he wanted to save the Jew. Moshe's entire life became saving people because he was someone who learned from the fact that he himself was saved. He was saved from the water, and he dedicated the rest of his life to saving others. Right? We were saved from the war. We are the survivors of the war. We have to dedicate ourselves to learning the lesson, even if we weren't there. That's really the point here. That's what Moshe is telling them, and that's what the Torah is telling us. At least one of the things, I believe. All right, let's see if we have time for something else. Oh, the actual line of where I said that, you can see it's on 596, and the top line it says, this is Vayikra of Elazar ve'al Tamar b'nei Aaron had no stream lemor, right? And it was wrathful with Eleazar and Tamar, Aaron's remaining sons, right? And that's all it says. But it leaves out the word. It uses the word nosrim as remaining, but noser means leftover, survivors, right? It fits better into the sentence to say remaining, and at a simple level, that's what it means. But they didn't. But the word has a deeper meaning. I'll just speak for a minute on the ending. The whole ending of the parsha deals with kosher, the laws of kosher. What's a kosher animal? What's a kosher fish? What's not a kosher fish, and so forth. And it spends a lot of time on this. The idea of kosher, you have to wonder why they put it in here. Because here they're talking all about the Mishkan, the acts of the Kohen, the holiness, right? All of the things having to do with holiness. And kosher is a nice mitzvah, but I don't see how it applies to the same thing. And the reality is that kosher is our ability to sustain ourselves in a holy way. That's really what it does. You see, you have basically, for our conversation, there are three types of food in the world. There's food that you like, that's not kosher. You have food that you don't like that is kosher, and then you have food that you like and is kosher, right? Yeah, those three types. So, for instance, like can be what you like the taste. It can also be what's good for you. So, for instance, whipped cream is kosher, but if you eat whipped cream all the time, you'll die. You can't live on that, right? But you'll be eating kosher. On the other hand, pig is not kosher, but if you eat pig every day, you very well could be healthy. And it has nutrients. You could, right? But what we want to do is to nourish our body and our soul at the same time. So we eat, let's say, a piece of corn. So a piece of corn, on one hand, nourishes your body, and it also nourishes your soul. So the world that God created puts nutrients into food that nourish your body. And the world that God created has spiritual nutrients put into some food, and that's called kosher. So if you eat kosher food that's also good for you, then you nourish your body and your soul. If you eat kosher food that's not good for you, you won't live that long, but you'll be keeping kosher. And if you only take care of yourself, but you don't eat kosher, you'll kill your spiritual side. You'll hurt your spiritual side the same way as if you were eating whipped cream all day, so to speak, but you'll be healthy. Right? So we see the three pieces. The idea of kosher is that we want to accomplish both. That's what we want to do. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone. Not everybody's soul has a sort of an opening for kosher. So like a non-Jew doesn't have that same type of thing as a Jew does. No different than, some people will eat certain foods and it won't necessarily give them any type of nutrition, while another person will get a nutrition from it. There are most foods everybody gets nutrition from, but there are some people who have certain sensitivities or certain issues within them that are genetic that will affect them. The Jews have a spiritual genetic disposition that certain foods we eat will nourish us spiritually, and certain foods will not. Right? That's something that's unique to us in a spiritual genetic manner, so to speak. And therefore it's very important. In fact, it says it's the whole section. The reason that this section is put in here, where it's dealing with sacrifices and holiness, is because we need to realize that keeping kosher is not a perfunctory secular mitzvah. Right? It's a holy mitzvah, and that when we eat what is appropriate to eat, that's kosher, then we are actually adding to the holiness. Just like when you eat food, it adds to your nutrition and your energy. When you eat kosher, it adds to your spirituality. And the concept of you are what you eat is found in the Talmud. The Talmud discusses this idea that you have people in the world who are aggressive and who are cruel. And the Talmud attributes some of this trait to the food that they eat. Now, I doubt that the Talmud means that it's literal and that it's totally exclusive to the food, that if they would switch to kosher food, for instance, that they become nice people. I don't believe that that's what it means. What it means is that there is an effect. In other words, if a person you'll notice that, for instance, that you don't really have carnivorous animals that are kosher. Right? You don't have lions, like animals that eat other animals. Right? You don't really have them that's kosher. These aggressive, violent animals that are known for this. And people who eat that, the Talmud's saying, have a certain cruel streak, or they could have a cruel streak, while people who don't. It says the Jewish people are known for their mercy. Sometimes they're merciful to a fault, right? We'll be merciful to our enemies, right? Which is not necessarily merciful. But, and some non-Jews are merciful and some are not, right? And then it says that the reason that some are not is because, it says in part, is because of the food they eat. Now, we can take that literally or we can take that philosophically, but the understanding is that what you eat, right, has an effect on you. And it has an effect not just physically, it has it also spiritually. And so we see this here, and that's why it's put into this section that deals with holiness, because eating kosher food has an effect on you in holiness. It affects you, and it makes a difference in your life. That's why, for instance, when it comes to children, we can do lots of things with children that are against the Torah, because they're so young. They don't have to do it. A child, you don't have to tell a child that they can't play with a toy that makes music on Shabbos. A little kid, you don't have to tell them, even though you're not allowed to play with it on Shabbos. Right? Why? Because they're little kids. They don't know. They don't understand Shabbos. They don't understand mitzvah. They don't understand any of this. How can you? But you can't give a little kid unkosher food. You have to give them kosher food from the day he's born, because the kosher food has an effect on them. There's an effect of the mitzvah, and then there's a spiritual effect on their soul by eating the kosher food. And therefore, even if they're too young to understand, it still affects them. While if they're too young to understand Shabbos, or fasting, or Passover, right, then a lot of these rules won't apply to them. But when it comes to kosher, even if they don't understand it, it affects them, because it's ingested into their body, becomes a part of them, right? And they're nourished off this. So as their body is nourished, their soul is nourished. And if their body is nourished and their soul is not nourished, it's a problem. So that's why the kosher is in here. And that really takes us to the end of the parsha.